In 1988, I was 11 years old. Summer vacations were my favorite because they meant our annual camping trip. Just me and my dad. We had this tradition. Every summer, if my grades were good, we'd pick a new spot, pack our gear, and head out for a weekend in the wild. That year, Dad chose a forest neither of us had been to before. It was known for its dense, almost magical fog that rolled in every night. Drive there was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the trees. The further we went, the more isolated I felt. Cell phones weren't a thing back then, but once you were out there, you were really out there. We arrived early, the sun barely peeking over the treetops. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I remember looking around and feeling a shiver run down my spine, even though it was a warm day. We set up our tent in a small clearing, had a quick lunch, and then Dad suggested a hike. We followed a trail that led us to a river, its waters crystal clear. That's when I saw it, half buried in the riverbed, a stone that glittered like a diamond. I picked it up, marveling at its beauty. It felt special, like I'd found a treasure. I showed it to Dad, who gave a low whistle. "That's quite a find, kiddo," he said, ruffling my hair. I slipped the stone into my pocket, feeling a strange connection to it. Little did I know, that simple act would set off a chain of events that would haunt us forever. As we continued our hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Forest seemed alive, but not in a comforting way. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, felt like eyes tracking our every move. The deeper we went, the darker it seemed to get, despite the sun still hanging in the sky. When we returned to our campsite, I couldn't wait to examine the stone further. It had an odd warmth to it, almost as if it were alive. The way it caught the light, casting tiny rainbows, was mesmerizing. Dad started a fire, and as the flames danced, I kept turning the stone over in my hands, feeling its smooth surface, tracing the tiny imperfections. "Time to hit the sack, buddy," Dad eventually said, yawning. I reluctantly put the stone in my backpack and crawled into the tent. The forest outside was pitch black, the dense fog starting to creep in, swallowing the world in a ghostly shroud. As I lay there, listening to the distant calls of night creatures, I felt a strange unease settle over me. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night, after a campfire dinner, we settled into our sleeping bags. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects and distant hoots of owls. But something felt off. As the fog thickened, the noises changed. Soft rustling, twigs snapping, and then a whisper. It started faint, almost like the wind, but grew louder. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. My heart pounded as I heard it. I wasn't dreaming. The whispers turned into a chant, an angry, accusing tone. Panic surged through me. I sat up, straining to hear more. The whisper seemed to be coming from all around us, circling our tent. I shook Dad awake, a voice trembling. "Dad, do you hear that?" He rubbed his eyes and listened. His expression shifted from groggy confusion to alarm. "What the hell?" he muttered. We both heard it now, clear as day. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. Dad grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the dense fog. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it felt like it barely made a dent. The whispers continued, louder now, almost shouting. My hands shook as I followed him outside, clutching the flashlight he handed me. "Who's there?" Dad called out, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice wavered. There was no response, just the relentless chant growing more insistent. The fog swirled around us, thick and suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree seemed to loom closer. "Dad, we need to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, and we quickly started packing up, our movements frantic and clumsy. Chanting didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, angrier. It felt like the forest itself was alive, demanding we obey its rules. We stumbled through the fog, heading back to the car. The forest seemed to close in on us, branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I clutched the stone in my pocket, its warmth now a burning heat against my skin. The whispers followed us, relentless and malevolent, until we finally reached the car and sped away, the headlights piercing the darkness, not the terror that clung to us. Only when we reached the main road did the oppressive atmosphere lift. We were safe, so we thought. As the car sped away from the forest, I glanced back and saw the fog recede, but the whispers still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the night's horrors. Back home, we tried to settle into normalcy, but the events of that night clung to us like a dark shadow. I thought leaving the forest would end our nightmare, but it was just the beginning. At first, it was subtle. Shadows in the corner of our eyes, strange noises at night. Felt like the forest had followed us, embedding itself in our lives. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again. Soft at first, barely audible, growing louder. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. I bolted upright, heart racing. The room was dark, but I felt eyes on me, unseen and unblinking. I ran to my parents' room, shaking Dad awake. "Dad, it's back!" The whispers. He looked at eyes bloodshot and tired. He heard them too. We both did. The house seemed to hum with the malevolent chant, the walls closing in, suffocating us with fear. We tried everything, lighting candles, praying, even sleeping in the same room, but nothing worked. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more insistent each night. Our home, once a place of safety, had become a prison of terror. I started to see things. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Faces in the dark, watching, waiting. Dad and I became paranoid, sleep-deprived, and irritable. We snapped at each other over the smallest things. My mom, who hadn't gone on the trip, started showing signs of mental strain too. She'd wake up screaming, claiming she saw figures standing at the foot of her bed, whispering. It was as if the entity had marked us all, spreading its madness like a disease. The whispers were driving us insane. They were everywhere, in the walls, in our minds, relentless and cruel. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Every night was a battle to stay sane, to not give in to the fear that gnawed at my soul. One night, as the whispers reached a fever pitch, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke down, tears streaming down my face. "Dad, it's the stone. It's the stone I took from the forest." My voice was hoarse from screaming over the incessant chanting. "We have to return it?" Dad's eyes widened in realization. "The stone," he muttered, a mix of anger and fear. Why didn't he tell me sooner? But there was no time for blame. We had to act. We grabbed the stone from my backpack and headed for the car, the whispers following us, growing louder and more frantic. The drive back to the forest was a blur, the darkness outside the car windows feeling like it was closing in on us. Chanting didn't stop, echoing in our heads, constant reminder of our impending doom. We had to return the stone. We had to make it stop. As we sped down the road, the fog began to rise again, and I knew the forest was waiting for us, hungry for what we had taken. The fog thickened as we neared the forest, tendrils of mist reaching out like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the car and suffocating the light from our headlights. The road seemed endless, an inky black ribbon winding into oblivion. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, an incessant chant that drilled into our minds. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. My hands shook as I clutched the stone, its heat searing through my pocket. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in grim determination. The car seemed to crawl, time stretching and warping as we drew closer to our destination. The forest loomed ahead, a dark mass shrouded in fog, its trees like twisted sentinels guarding their domain. We parked at the edge of the trail and stepped out into the oppressive silence. The air was thick with anticipation, the fog swirling around our ankles. Every step felt heavy, as if the forest was pulling us deeper into its embrace. The whispers grew louder, chant now a roar, demanding restitution. We retraced our steps, following the same path we had taken before. The forest seemed alive, every shadow watching, every branch reaching out to snag us. I clutched the stone tightly, feeling its unnatural warmth seep into my bones. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing the relentless chant. Finally, we reached the river. The water was dark, its surface disturbed by unseen currents. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I held the stone over the water. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices screaming in my head. I took a deep breath and let the stone fall, watching as it disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The fog began to lift, the oppressive weight in the air dissipating. The forest, once menacing, now seemed almost peaceful. We stood there, panting, our breaths mingling with the cool night air. It felt like we had emerged from a nightmare. But the relief was short-lived. We hurried back to the car, eager to leave the forest behind. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The chanting had stopped. The memory of it lingered, a ghostly echo in the back of our minds. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the house seemed welcoming, a stark contrast to the terror we had faced. But as the days passed, we realized the true extent of what we had endured. The entity might have stopped haunting us, but its presence lingered in our minds, a permanent scar on our psyches. My mom's condition worsened. She became increasingly paranoid and withdrawn, haunted by visions of shadowy figures and whispering voices. Dad and I were never the same, the fear and paranoia gnawing at us, eroding our sanity bit by bit. The forest had taken something from us, something intangible but vital. It had left a mark, an indelible stain on our souls. We had returned the stone. The cost was far greater than we could have imagined. Our lives, once ordinary and safe, had been irrevocably altered. The forest's whispers were gone, but their echo remained, a haunting reminder of the night we disturbed something ancient and vengeful. Every night, as I lay in bed, I could still feel the forest's eyes on me, watching, waiting. The darkness seemed to whisper, faintest echo of a chant that would never truly leave us. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. I always thought summer trips were supposed to be fun, a break from our monotonous lives. When Andrew, James, and I finally found a free weekend to visit New Orleans, it felt like a long-awaited escape. We'd been talking about it since last year, but life kept getting in the way. But this weekend, everything aligned perfectly. We all managed to get time off work, and nothing could stop us from having the best time of our lives. We set off from Dallas on the evening of July 4th. The air was thick with the promise of adventure, but as we drove further, the atmosphere grew heavier. A dense fog rolled in, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was strange, almost unnatural. Texas isn't known for its fog, especially not in the summer. Andrew, sitting in the passenger seat, was the first to notice something was off. He's always been the observant one, catching details the rest of us missed. When he opened the car door to grab his jacket, he hesitated, staring into the fog as if it held some dark secret. "Do you feel that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I glanced at him, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "It's just fog, man. We'll be fine." But Andrew's instincts have never been wrong. I should have known better than to dismiss his concern. He closed the door slowly, his eyes still fixed on the fog, as if expecting something to emerge from it. We hit the road again, but the eerie feeling lingered. The fog was so thick, felt like we were driving through a cloud. The headlights barely pierced the gloom, casting strange, shifting shadows on the road. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. James, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Hey, maybe we'll run into some ghosts before we even reach New Orleans." He laughed, but his voice sounded strained, almost as if he didn't believe his own words. We laughed it off. The fog seemed to press in on us, swallowing our laughter and replacing it with an oppressive silence. Felt like the world outside the car didn't exist anymore, just an endless expanse of gray. As we drove on, the sense of unease only grew. Andrew kept glancing out the window, his eyes darting back and forth, tracking shadows that weren't there. The fog seemed alive, shifting and swirling in ways that defied explanation. "This week has to be the best," I repeated to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Nothing was going to ruin this trip for us. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The further we drove, the thicker the fog became, transforming our surroundings into a murky nightmare. It felt like we were the only souls left in a world that had vanished, replaced by an endless, suffocating mist. The road stretched out before us, swallowed by the fog, the headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. As we ventured deeper into the haze, the car's atmosphere grew tense. Every mile seemed to pull us further from reality and deeper into something unknown and sinister. Andrew's eyes were glued to the window, his face pale and tense. I could see the worry etched into his features, and it made my stomach churn. A burst sound came out of nowhere. A low, guttural noise that seemed to resonate from the fog itself. It echoed around us, making my skin crawl. I glanced at James in the rearview mirror. His carefree demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of genuine unease. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, leaning forward as if to peer deeper into the gloom. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just some animal. We're in the middle of nowhere." But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. The sound was too unnatural. It seemed to vibrate through the car, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Andrew shifted in his seat, his eyes still scanning the fog. "I've never heard anything like that before," he said quietly. "You should be careful." We drove on, the oppressive silence only broken by the occasional, inexplicable noises from the fog. Scratches, whispers, the faint sound of something moving just beyond our sight. Each noise made my grip on the steering wheel tighten. Then Andrew stiffened, his eyes widening as he pointed ahead. "Did you see that?" I squinted, trying to see through the dense fog. "See what?" "There was someone, standing on the side of the road," he said, voice shaking. I shook my head. "It's just your imagination. Fog is playing tricks on us." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The fog seemed alive, filled with shadows that twisted and shifted like something out of a nightmare. I tried to focus on the road. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the car, and it jolted to one side. I fought to keep control, my heart pounding in my chest. The steering wheel vibrated violently in my hands, and I managed to pull over to the side of the road. "What now?" James groaned from the back seat, his voice tinged with fear. I stepped out into the fog, the thick air pressing in around me. The rear tire was completely flat. As I crouched down to inspect it, I felt the weight of the fog bearing down on me, almost like it was watching, waiting. "We have a flat," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's change it quickly and get out of here." Andrew and James joined me, their faces pale and anxious. As we worked to change the tire, the strange noises grew louder, closer. Scratching sounds, almost like claws on metal, and whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Andrew's hands shook as he helped with the jack. "We need to hurry," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this. I don't like any of this." Neither did I. The fog pressed in around us, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching us. But when I blinked, it was gone. We finished changing the tire as quickly as we could, our movements frantic. The strange noises seemed to mock us, growing louder, more insistent. We jumped back into the car, slamming the doors shut as if that thin barrier could protect us from whatever lurked in the fog. As we sped off into the night, the fog seemed to follow, a malevolent force that wouldn't let us go. The sense of dread only deepened. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a threshold into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The journey to New Orleans was supposed to be a fun escape, but now it felt like we were being pulled into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The further we drove, the more the sense of unease grew. It was like we were driving through some forgotten corner of the world, where time and space had warped into a suffocating, endless fog. The noises hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown louder and more persistent, as if something was following us, unseen but ever present. Suddenly, the car lurched violently, and a loud pop echoed through the fog. I fought to keep control, my heart racing as the steering wheel jerked in my hands. We veered to the side of the road, coming to a jarring halt. "Not again," James groaned from the back seat, his voice a mix of frustration and fear. I stepped out into the oppressive fog, the thick air closing in around me like a living thing. The front tire was completely blown out, shredded beyond repair. I cursed under my breath, a feeling of being watched growing stronger with each passing second. "We've got another flat," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to change it and get out of here fast." Andrew and James climbed out of the car, their faces pale and anxious. Andrew's hands shook as he grabbed the jack, his eyes darting around the fog as if expecting something to leap out at any moment. As we worked to change the tire, the strange noises grew louder, more distinct. There were whispers, like a chorus of disembodied voices, and the occasional scratching sound that set my teeth on edge. It felt like we were being hunted. "Hurry up," Andrew urged, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." I could feel his fear mirrored in my own racing heart. The fog seemed to press in closer, wrapping us in its cold, damp embrace. As I tightened the last lug nut, I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the edge of the light. A shadow, tall and thin, sliding through the mist with a fluid, unnatural grace. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Andrew looked up, his face ashen. "I saw it too," he said, his voice barely audible. "Let's go now." We scrambled back into the car, slamming the doors shut, as if that thin barrier could protect us from whatever was out there. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the fog just enough to see the road ahead. We sped off, the tires kicking up gravel as we raced to put as much distance between us and the nightmare behind us. But the fog didn't relent. It followed us, a relentless shroud that seemed to grow darker and more malevolent with each passing mile. The noises continued, growing louder and more insistent, as if whatever was out there was getting closer. Andrew's face was pressed to the window, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he asked, voice trembling. "Something's following us." I glanced in the rearview mirror, but all I could see was the dense, impenetrable fog. "I don't see anything," I said, but my voice betrayed my fear. "There's something out there," he insisted. "Something's following us." James shifted uneasily in the back seat. "This isn't right," he said. "We should turn back. We should go home." But there was no going back. We were too far into the nightmare now, too deep in the fog. All we could do was keep driving, hoping to outrun whatever horrors lurked in the mist. As we drove, the sense of dread only deepened. The fog seemed to close in around us, wrapping us in its cold, clammy embrace. The noises grew louder, more insistent, a constant reminder that we were not alone. And with every passing mile, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if something in the fog was drawing closer, ready to strike. We had set out for a fun weekend, a break from our mundane lives. But now it felt like we had entered a waking nightmare, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied, and where the only thing we could count on was the growing sense of terror that gripped us all. We finally arrived at the campsite, though it felt like the fog had followed us, seeping into the very air we breathed. The dense mist wrapped around the trees, making the forest seem like a maze of shadows and ghostly shapes. The night was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your own breathing seem unnaturally loud. We parked the car and stepped out, fog swirling around our feet. The campsite was deserted, fire pits cold and unused. It should have felt like a peaceful retreat, but instead felt like a graveyard. James stretched and yawned, trying to shake off the tension. "I'll go gather some firewood. We need to get a fire going before it gets any colder." "Be quick," Andrew said, his eyes darting nervously around the campsite. "This place gives me the creeps." James shrugged and headed into the woods, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the fog. I watched him disappear into the trees, a sense of unease settling in my gut. The fog seemed to swallow him whole, and soon, his light was just a dim glow in the distance. Andrew and I set up the tent, our movements hurried and clumsy. The strange noises we had heard on the road seemed to have followed us, growing louder and more persistent. Scratches, whispers, and the occasional rustle of leaves that made my skin crawl. Minutes turned into an hour, and there was still no sign of James. Firewood he was supposed to gather was nowhere to be seen, and his flashlight's glow had long since vanished. "Where is he?" Andrew muttered, voice tinged with worry. "He should be back by now." I grabbed my flashlight and handed another to Andrew. "Let's go find him. He probably just got turned around in the fog." We ventured into the woods, the dense mist swallowing our beams of light. Forest felt alive, the trees pressing in on us, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out of the darkness. The strange noises grew louder, echoing through the fog, making it hard to pinpoint their source. "James," I called, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the vastness of the night. There was no response, just the oppressive silence and the whispering fog. We pushed further into the woods, our steps hesitant and uncertain. Fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around us like a shroud, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, a figure appeared ahead, stumbling through the fog. For a moment, relief washed over me, thinking it was James. But as he drew closer, my heart sank. It was James, But something was horribly wrong. His clothes were torn, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, usually so full of life, were empty, almost lifeless. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet on strings. "James, what happened?" Andrew called out, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my own fear in check. "But we need to get out of here. Now." He jumped into the car, but the engine wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, but all I got was a sickening click. Fog pressed in around us, the noises growing louder, closer. Then, without warning, something yanked Andrew out of the car with a force that sent me sprawling. I scrambled out, clutching the hatchet we had brought for firewood, my heart pounding in my chest. "Andrew," I shouted, but there was no answer, just the oppressive silence and the thick, suffocating fog. I stumbled through the campsite, the hatchet held tightly in my trembling hands. I found Andrew's clothes, torn and bloodied, scattered near the edge of the clearing. He was gone. Old dread settled over me. Whatever had taken James had now taken Andrew. I was alone, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The fog seemed to close in around me, and I knew I had to get out, or I would be next. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the silent woods, a hatchet clutched tightly in my hand. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. I ran through the forest, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, each step feeling like it was tearing me apart. Fog was relentless, wrapping around me like a living thing, slowing my movements, making it hard to see where I was going. The sounds of pursuit were right behind me. Footsteps, whispers, and that same guttural growl that had come from James. I stumbled over roots and rocks, the forest floor a treacherous maze in the thick fog. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum in the eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was alive, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I glanced back once, and my blood ran cold. Through the swirling mist, I saw a shadowy figure moving with unnatural speed, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't James anymore. Whatever had taken him had turned him into something else, something monstrous. "Please, no," I whispered to myself, forcing my legs to move faster. The hatchet in my hand felt like a flimsy defense against whatever was hunting me. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my leg as I tripped over a hidden root. I hit the ground hard, air knocked out of my lungs. For a moment, the world spun, and I struggled to get back up. The whispers grew louder, mocking me, closing in. I managed to stand, limping forward, every step agony. The headlights I had seen earlier seemed impossibly far away now, a distant beacon in an ocean of fog. I had to reach them. They were my only hope. Growls grew louder, more insistent, and I knew that whatever was behind me was getting closer. I didn't dare look back again. I focused on the faint glow of the headlights, using them as my guide, my lifeline. My vision blurred with tears of pain and fear, but I forced myself to keep moving. The fog seemed to thicken, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The whispers became a cacophony, a chorus of voices urging me to give up, to surrender to the darkness. I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close. I burst out of the trees, stumbling onto the narrow strip of highway that cut through the forest. The headlights were closer now, the shape of a truck becoming clear through the fog. Relief flooded through me, giving me the strength to push forward. I waved my arms frantically, shouting for help. The truck slowed, its brakes squealing in the stillness of the night. A burly figure stepped out, the truck's lights illuminating his concerned face. "Help me," I gasped, collapsing to my knees. "Something's in the woods. It's after me. It took my friends." Trucker's eyes widened, and he hurried over, helping me to my feet. "Easy now, easy," he said, his voice a comforting rumble. "Let's get you out of here." He helped me into the truck. I slumped into the passenger seat, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. As he started the engine, I glanced back at the edge of the forest. Fog seemed to writhe and pulse, as if alive, but there was no sign of the figure that had been chasing me. The truck pulled onto the highway, the engine's roar, comforting sound in the oppressive silence. The trucker glanced at me, his expression serious. "You're lucky I came along when I did," he said. "These woods, they're not right. People have been disappearing here for years." I nodded, too exhausted to speak. The truck's warmth seeped into my bones, and I felt my eyes growing heavy. The adrenaline that had kept me going was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. As I drifted off to sleep, the last thing I heard was the trucker's voice, low and ominous. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. Whatever's out there doesn't let go easily." I shivered, the words echoing in my mind as darkness claimed me. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. I woke with a start, the truck's engine still humming beneath me. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The events of the night before seemed like a distant, horrible dream. But the bruises and cuts on my body told me it was all too real. The trucker, a grizzled man named Hank, glanced at me, his face etched with concern. "We're almost at a truck stop," he said. "You can get cleaned up there, maybe get some food. You look like you've been through hell." "Thank you," I muttered, my voice hoarse. The events of the night replayed in my mind, each memory sharper and more terrifying than the last. I couldn't shake the image of James or whatever he had become, chasing us through the fog, and Andrew, I had no idea what had happened to him. We pulled into the truck stop, a small oasis of light and warmth in the middle of the dark, fog-shrouded highway. Hank helped me out of the truck, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be here if you need anything." I nodded, making my way to the restroom. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the cracked tiles. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the person staring back. My eyes were wide and haunted, my face pale and streaked with dirt and dried blood. I splashed water on my face, trying to wash away the fear and exhaustion. Didn't help. The sense of dread clung to me, a dark shadow that refused to let go. I couldn't stop thinking about what Hank had said. People had been disappearing in those woods for years. What had we stumbled into? After cleaning up as best I could, I joined Hank at a small table in the truck stop diner. The waitress brought us coffee, and I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my cold fingers. Hank watched me closely, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You want to tell me what happened out there?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. We were on our way to New Orleans, just a weekend trip. Everything was fine until the fog rolled in. Then, strange things started happening. I recounted the events as best I could, from the eerie sounds and strange sightings to the moment James disappeared and Andrew was dragged away. Hank listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When I finished, he let out a long sigh. "I've heard stories like this before. Truckers talk, you know? There's something out there in those woods, something that doesn't want to be found. People go missing, and those who come back, well, they're never the same." I shuddered, his words confirming my worst fears. "What do I do now?" "I can't just leave them out there." Hank shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive. Going back would be suicide. Your friends, I hate to say it, but they're gone. Whatever took them won't let them go." A cold chill ran down my spine. The thought of leaving James and Andrew behind, lost to whatever horror lurked in the fog, was almost too much to bear. But Hank was right. Going back would be a death sentence. I stared into my coffee, my mind racing. "What is it, Hank? What's out there?" He hesitated, glancing around the diner as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Some say it's the spirits of those who've died in the woods. Others think it's something older, something evil that's been there for centuries. Whatever it is, it feeds on fear, on souls. And once it has you in its grip, it doesn't let go." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Fog, the noises, the way James had changed, it all made a horrifying kind of sense. We had been lured into a trap, prey for something ancient and malevolent. Hank reached across the table, his hand firm on mine. "You need to move on, kid. Get as far away from those woods as you can. The only way to stay safe." I nodded, though the thought of leaving felt like a betrayal. But deep down, I knew he was right. The forest had claimed my friends, and if I wasn't careful, it would claim me too. As we left the truck stop, the fog had lifted slightly, the morning light casting long shadows across the highway. But the sense of dread remained, a constant reminder of the horrors I had escaped. I climbed back into the truck, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a physical force. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the forest, the dark trees standing like silent sentinels. I knew that whatever was out there wasn't finished with me. The nightmare was far from over. The drive back to Dallas was a blur. Hank's words echoed in my mind, constant reminder of the horror I had narrowly escaped. We didn't talk much after leaving the truck stop. The road stretched endlessly before us, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the fog-covered landscape. Despite the truck's warmth, I couldn't shake the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I kept seeing James and Andrew's faces, hearing the strange noises that had followed us through the woods. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the memories came rushing back, more vivid and terrifying than before. When we finally reached Dallas, Hank dropped me off at my apartment. I thanked him, though words felt inadequate. He gave me a solemn nod, his eyes conveying a world of understanding. As he drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. My friends were gone, and I was left to face the aftermath alone. The first night back in my apartment was a nightmare. I tossed and turned, unable to find any semblance of peace. Every creak and groan of the old building set my heart racing. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Fog had followed me, not in reality, but in my mind. It seeped into my thoughts, tainting everything with fear and unease. I kept the lights on, hoping they would ward off the darkness that seemed to close in from all sides. But the lights couldn't protect me from my memories. I saw James's haunted eyes, heard the growl that had come from his throat. I felt Andrew's panic as he was dragged away, the helplessness of not being able to save him. Days turned into weeks, and the nightmares didn't let up. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from concerned friends and family. I couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't make them understand the horror of it all. How could they? They hadn't seen what I had seen, hadn't felt the icy grip of fear that still clung to me. I started seeing a therapist, hoping they could help me make sense of it all. But even that felt like a losing battle. Sessions were filled with questions I couldn't answer. Memories couldn't escape. The therapist prescribed medication to help with the anxiety and insomnia. The pills did little more than take the edge off. The nightmares persisted, relentless and unforgiving. One night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard a familiar sound, a low guttural growl. My heart skipped a beat, my body freezing in terror. Sound came again, closer this time, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I wasn't alone. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The growl came again, and this time it was accompanied by a soft whispering, chorus of voices that seemed to come from all directions. The fog had found me, even here, in the safety of my own home. Panicking, I grabbed the hatchet I had kept since that night in the woods. I had brought it back with me, a grim reminder of what had happened, and a flimsy sense of security. I crept through the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest, the hatchet held tightly in my trembling hands. The whispers grew louder, the growls more insistent. I felt a presence behind me, cold and malevolent. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, filled with shadows and echoes of my own fear. I stumbled back into the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The whispers didn't stop. They seemed to fade, becoming a distant murmur. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The hatchet slipped from my fingers, landing with a dull thud on the carpet. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Fog, the fear, it would consume me if I let it. I needed to find a way to confront it, to make peace with what had happened. But how could I do that when the nightmare was never ending, when the darkness refused to let me go? I closed my eyes, trying to find some semblance of calm. The therapist had given me exercises to help ground myself, to bring me back to reality. I focused on my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale, trying to push the whispers and growls out of my mind. But even as I found a momentary respite, I knew the fog was waiting. It was always there, just beyond the edge of consciousness, ready to pull me back into the nightmare. The only question was, how long could I keep it at bay? And what would happen when it finally caught up to me? Panicking, I grabbed the hatchet I had kept since that night in the woods. I had brought it back with me, a grim reminder of what had happened, and a flimsy sense of security. I crept through the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest, the hatchet held tightly in my trembling hands. The whispers grew louder, the growls more insistent. I felt a presence behind me, old and malevolent. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, filled with shadows and echoes of my own fear. I stumbled back into the bedroom, locking the door behind me. The whispers didn't stop, but they seemed to fade, becoming a distant murmur. I sat on the edge of the bed, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The hatchet slipped from my fingers, landing with a dull thud on the carpet. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep living like this. Fog, the fear, it would consume me if I let it. I needed to find a way to confront it, to make peace with what had happened. But how could I do that when the nightmare was never ending, when the darkness refused to let me go? I closed my eyes, trying to find some semblance of calm. The therapist had given me exercises to help ground myself, to bring me back to reality. I focused on my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale, trying to push the whispers and growls out of my mind. But even as I found a momentary respite, I knew the fog was waiting. It was always there, just beyond the edge of consciousness, ready to pull me back into the nightmare. The only question was, how long could I keep it at bay, and what would happen when it finally caught up to me? The weeks that followed were a haze of fear and sleepless nights. Every time I closed my eyes, the memories came flooding back, more vivid and terrifying than ever. The fog, the whispers, the guttural growls, they were all there, waiting for me in the darkness. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change, or I would lose my mind. One night, driven by desperation, I decided to return to the therapist. Dr. Roberts was a kind woman, patient and understanding. She listened to my story without judgment, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She suggested a more intensive treatment, a combination of therapy and medication that might help me find some peace. I agreed, willing to try anything to escape the nightmare that had become my life. The sessions were exhausting, dragging up memories I had tried to bury. But slowly, I started to see a glimmer of hope. The nightmares became less frequent, the whispers and growls less insistent. For the first time since that night in the woods, I felt like I might be able to move on. But the peace was short-lived. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, I heard a noise that sent a chill down my spine. It was a familiar sound, one I had hoped never to hear again. A low, guttural growl. My heart raced, my body freezing in terror. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The fog had found me again. Panicking, I grabbed the hatchet from under my bed and crept through the apartment. The growls grew louder, accompanied by the soft, mocking whispers that had haunted my dreams. I felt a cold presence behind me, a malevolent force that seemed to fill the room. I spun around, swinging the hatchet wildly, but there was nothing there, just the empty apartment, filled with shadows and echoes of my fear. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I had escaped the woods. I was safe. But the fog had followed me, bringing the terror with it. As I backed into the living room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was James, or at least what was left of him. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and a twisted smile played on his lips. "Miss me?" he whispered, his voice a chilling echo of the friend I had lost. I raised the hatchet, my hands trembling. "Stay back," I warned, though my voice was weak and filled with fear. James took a step forward, his smile widening. "You can't escape it, you know. Fog. It's everywhere. It's inside you." He swung the hatchet, but he moved too quickly, dodging the blow with unnatural speed. He laughed, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You're already lost, just like Andrew and me." Desperation clawed at my mind. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let the fog take me too. With a burst of adrenaline, I charged at him, the hatchet raised high. But as I swung, the room seemed to twist and blur, the shadows closing in around me. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, the hatchet beside me. James was gone, the apartment eerily silent. I staggered to my feet, my head spinning. Had it all been a hallucination? A trick of the mind, brought on by stress and fear? But as I looked around, I saw something that made my heart stop. Written on the walls, in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't escape." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Fog wasn't just in the woods. It was everywhere, a part of me that I could never escape. It had followed me home, haunting me, driving me to the brink of madness. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind reeling. I knew then that there was no escaping the fog. No amount of therapy or medication could change that. It was a part of me now, a dark shadow that would follow me for the rest of my life. As the night wore on, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Growls echoed through the apartment, a constant reminder of the horror I had faced. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was my life now. A never-ending nightmare from which there was no escape. In the days that followed, I withdrew further into myself, shutting out the world. The fog was relentless, a constant presence that filled my mind with fear and dread. I stopped seeing Dr. Roberts, stopped taking the medication. Nothing could help me now. One night, as I sat in the darkness, the whispers grew louder, the growls more insistent. I felt the cold presence closing in, fog wrapping around me like a shroud, and I knew, with a clarity that cut through the fear, that there was only one way to escape. I picked up the hatchet. The weight of it familiar in my hand, the whispers seemed to cheer, urging me on. I walked to the window, looking out at the fog-covered street. The darkness beckoned, promise of peace that I could no longer resist. With a final, determined breath, I stepped out into the night, the hatchet at my side. Fog closed in around me, cold and relentless, and as the whispers consumed me, I felt a strange sense of calm. The nightmare was finally over. It was 1985, and I remember the night vividly. My parents had just left to visit my aunt, my mom's sister, who had an urgent need for help. She had suffered some kind of domestic accident, and they wanted to see how she was doing. Normally, I wouldn't be left alone, but they assured me it would be a quick visit. They'd be back in a few hours. As they closed the door behind them, a strange feeling washed over me, a mix of unease and dread. The house was unusually quiet. I tried to distract myself with some TV, but the static on the screen only added to my growing anxiety. The rain outside began to pour heavily, thunder rumbling in the distance, and a thick fog started to creep down our deserted street. I could feel the air grow colder. The once cozy home now felt eerie and uninviting. I thought about calling my parents, but I didn't want to seem scared. Besides, they'd be back soon, right? As the minutes dragged on, the lights began to flicker. At first, it was just a slight dimming, but soon they were flashing on and off violently, plunging the room into darkness before bathing it in harsh, bright light again. Each flicker made my heart race a little faster. Suddenly, the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. I hesitated before picking up the receiver, my hand trembling. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was nothing on the other end, just an eerie static. "Hello?" I repeated, but the only response was the crackling silence. I hung up, feeling a cold sweat form on my forehead. Trying to shake off the fear, I decided to check the house. Maybe there was a logical explanation for all this weirdness. As I moved through the rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rain pounded against the windows, and the fog outside seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to seep inside. Just as I was about to head back to the living room, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving near the basement door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The basement was always creepy. This was different. The shadow seemed to have form and intent. My instincts screamed at me to run. Curiosity and a morbid sense of duty kept me rooted in place. Slowly, I approached the basement door. The air grew colder with each step, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grasped the doorknob. The door creaked open, and a wave of icy air hit me. Stairs descended into darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving down there, something unnatural. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an intruder? An animal? Or something far worse? I took a deep breath and steeled myself. Whatever it was, I had to know. The house, my sanctuary, had become a place of terror, and there was no turning back now. With the basement door now ajar, the darkness seemed to beckon me, its icy grip tightening around my spine. The rain outside pounded relentlessly, each drop echoing the growing sense of dread within me. Thunder rumbled ominously, shaking the house to its very foundation. As I stood at the top of the basement stairs, I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down. broken only by the occasional flicker of the lights above. I took a tentative step forward, the wooden stairs creaking under my weight. Each creak seemed to resonate with the beating of my heart, faster and louder with every step I took. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to dance just beyond the reach of the flickering light. Thick, musty smell filled my nostrils, a scent that seemed to whisper of decay and forgotten memories. Halfway down the stairs, I paused, straining my ears to catch any sound from below. For a moment, there was nothing but the pounding rain and my own ragged breathing. Then, faintly, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering. It was a language I couldn't understand, but its tone was unmistakable. It was a call, a beckoning from the darkness. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my feet meeting the cold, concrete floor of the basement. The flickering light from above barely penetrated the inky blackness, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers brushing against the cool, damp wall. When I finally found it and flicked it on, the bare bulb overhead sputtered to life, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the room. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the basement, something was moving. At first, it was just a shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something more. A figure, hunched and grotesque, emerged from the darkness. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its skin was a sickly, pallid gray. It looked up at me, its mouth curling into a twisted grin. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It seemed to savor my fear, feeding off the terror that coursed through my veins. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker again, plunging the basement into a strobe-like nightmare. The creature moved closer, its grotesque features illuminated in brief, horrifying flashes. It reached out a clawed hand, and I could feel the cold radiating from its touch even before it made contact. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped my body. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I could hear the creature's guttural growls, its footsteps echoing in the confined space. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The door rattled as the creature pounded against it, each thud sending shock waves of fear through me. I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out of the house. I had to find help. But as I turned to make my escape, I realized with growing horror that the nightmare was far from over. The lights in the house flickered and died, plunging me into darkness once more. And in the silence that followed, I heard the whispering again, closer this time, and all around me. The rain continued to pour outside, the storm growing more violent with each passing moment. The fog pressed against the windows, and the shadows in the house seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in the dim light. I was trapped, alone in the dark with something unspeakable, and there was no one coming to save me. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned against the basement door, trying to catch my breath. Pounding from the other side had stopped, placed by an unnerving silence. I strained to listen, hoping that the creature had given up. Deep down, I knew better. The house felt alive with a sinister energy, the shadows seeming to pulse and writhe in the corners of my vision. I took a step forward, my legs trembling. The rain outside lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I needed to get out, find help. As I moved through the hallway, the lights flickered back on, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to reach out for me. The air was thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the house set my nerves on edge. Suddenly I saw it again, a shadow moving at the far end of the hallway. It was just a glimpse, fleeting darkness that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. My heart skipped a beat. Was it the same creature from the basement, or was something else lurking in the shadows? I couldn't tell. The fear was palpable, cold knot in my stomach. I moved cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. As I passed the living room, I noticed the television had turned on by itself, the screen flickering with static. I approached it slowly, my reflection distorted in the black and white noise. Suddenly, a face appeared on the screen, pale and distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I jumped back, a scream caught in my throat. but the face vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The phone rang again, the shrill sound cutting through the silence. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. With a deep breath, picked it up. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaky. There was a moment of silence, then the same eerie static. But this time, there was something else. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, saying my name. "Get out." Hissed, the voice low and menacing. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. I turned towards the front door, my only escape, but the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the wind, and standing in the doorway was the same grotesque figure I had seen in the basement. It was taller now, its limbs elongated and its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Grinned at me, its mouth full of sharp, jagged teeth. I took a step back, my mind racing. There was no way out. The creature took a step forward, movements slow and deliberate, savoring my fear. In a blind panic, I turned and ran up the stairs, my legs barely able to carry me. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. I reached my bedroom and slammed the door shut, pushing my dresser against it for good measure. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room for any sign of the creature. The pounding on the door started again, each thud louder and more insistent than the last. The dresser shook, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Desperation set in as I looked around for another way out. My eyes landed on the window, and I rushed over, fumbling with the lock. Wind howled as I pushed the window open, the rain lashing against my face. I climbed out onto the ledge, the ground far below. It was a long drop. I had no choice. I took a deep breath and jumped, the world spinning around me as I fell. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body. I struggled to my feet, my legs trembling. The creature was still inside, but I knew it wouldn't be long before it found me. I stumbled down the street, the fog swallowing me up as I ran. The rain continued to pour, the storm growing more violent with each passing moment. As I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to move with me, whispering my name in the wind. I knew I couldn't stop, couldn't look back. The nightmare was far from over, and the real horror was only just beginning. I ran blindly through the fog-drenched streets, my heart pounding and my breath ragged. The cold rain lashed against my face, mixing with the tears that I could no longer hold back. The shadows seemed to follow me, closing in, whispering my name with each gust of wind. I felt trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I stumbled and fell to my knees, the wet pavement scraping against my skin. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away from that house, from whatever unspeakable horror had emerged from the basement. As I struggled to my feet, a strange light caught my eye. It was coming from the end of the street, flickering like a dying flame. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, like a moth to a flame. I approached cautiously, my heart still hammering in my chest. The light was coming from an old, dilapidated house that looked even more foreboding than my own. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung ajar, swaying in the wind. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick and musty, filled with the scent of decay. Flickering light came from a single candle on a table in the middle of the room, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized I wasn't alone. In the corner of the room stood the creature, its grotesque form illuminated by the candlelight. It was even more terrifying up close, its skin a sickly gray, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Grinned at me, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, to back away slowly. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The creature's grin widened, and it took a step forward. "You don't belong here," hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This place is ours." My mind raced, trying to make sense of its words. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The creature tilted its head, as if considering the question. "To make you understand." replied, "To make you see." Before I could react, the creature lunged at me, claws outstretched. I screamed and turned to run, but the front door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I could feel the creature's cold breath on my neck as it closed in, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. I ran through the house, desperately searching for an escape. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, savoring my fear. I stumbled into a room at the back of the house, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was empty, save for a large, cracked mirror on the far wall. I could see my reflection, pale and terrified, but something else was there too. In the mirror, the creature stood behind me, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I spun around, but the room was empty. My mind was playing tricks on me, terror driving me to the brink of madness. I backed away from the mirror, my eyes never leaving the reflection. The creature moved closer, its grin widening. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and screamed, turning to face my tormentor. But there was nothing there, just the empty room and the flickering candlelight. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with their insidious words. "You will never escape, Ahest. This is your home now." I covered my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more persistent. I could feel my sanity slipping away, the darkness closing in. I had to get out, had to escape this living nightmare. I rushed to the window, struggling to open it. The old, rusted frame refused to budge, and I pounded on the glass in desperation. The creature's reflection appeared in the window, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I screamed and lashed out, shattering the glass. The cold night air rushed in, bringing with it a brief moment of clarity. I climbed through the broken window, cutting my hands on the jagged shards. I didn't care about the pain. I just needed to get away. As I stumbled into the street, I glanced back at the house. The light inside flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I was free, but I knew I would never truly escape the horror of that night. I ran through the fog, my mind racing. The nightmare was far from over, and I knew the creature was still out there, waiting, watching. And as I fled, I could still hear its whispers, a haunting reminder of the terror that would follow me for the rest of my life. Fog seemed to thicken as I ran, cold night air biting at my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Every shadow, every whisper of wind seemed to carry the creature's presence. I could still feel its cold, malevolent eyes on me, as if it were just a step behind, relishing in my terror. I stumbled through the deserts, my mind racing. I needed to find help, to find someone, anyone who could save me from this nightmare. But the town seemed empty, abandoned. The only sounds were the rain and my own frantic footsteps. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting eerie, shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I turned a corner and saw a small convenience store at the end of the block, its neon sign flickering weakly. Hope surged through me, and I sprinted towards it, my legs burning with the effort. I burst through the door, the bell above it jingling loudly. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh and unsteady, casting a sickly glow over the aisles. "Hope, please, someone help me," I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty store. There was no response. The place was deserted, shelves lined with dusty, untouched products. I ran to the counter, frantically searching for a phone. There was one, but it was an old rotary model, and my shaking hands struggled to dial. Just as I managed to dial the first few numbers, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. Panic gripped me as I fumbled with the phone, the static of the line growing louder in my ear. Then, from the back of the store, I heard it. A low, guttural growl. I turned, my eyes straining to see in the darkness. The creature was there, its eyes glowing with that sickly yellow light. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the fear that radiated from me. I dropped the phone and backed away, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body frozen in place. The creature reached out a clawed hand, its fingers curling around the edge of the counter. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "This is your home now." With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free of my paralysis and ran towards the back of the store. I crashed through a door marked "Employees Only." finding myself in a narrow hallway lined with storage boxes. Creature's footsteps echoed behind me, slow and relentless. I reached the end of the hallway and found a fire exit. I slammed against the bar, bursting out into the alley behind the store. The rain poured down harder than ever, the wind howling through the narrow space. I slipped and fell, the ground slick with rain and filth. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the creature emerge from the doorway, its eyes glowing brighter in the darkness. I ran, my mind a blur of terror and desperation. I could feel the creature closing in, its presence a constant weight on my back. I darted through the maze of alleys, turning corners blindly, hoping to lose it in the labyrinthine streets. But no matter how fast I ran, it was always there, a step behind, its whispers filling my mind. Finally, I burst out onto a main street, the bright lights of a diner catching my eye. I sprinted towards it, hope flaring in my chest once more. I crashed through the door, the warmth and light of the diner a stark contrast to the cold, wet darkness outside. Few patrons inside looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Help, please, you have to help me," I cried, my voice raw with desperation. A kind-looking waitress hurried over, concern etched on her face. "What happened? Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soothing. There's something after me." Gasp, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "You have to help me, please." She glanced outside, her expression turning to confusion. "I don't see anything, honey." "Are you sure?" I turned to look, and for a moment, the street outside was empty. The fog had lifted slightly, and the rain had lessened to a drizzle. But I knew better. Creature was out there, hiding, waiting for its moment to strike. "Please, you have to believe me," I insisted, my voice trembling. "It's real. It's coming for me." The waitress exchanged a worried look with one of the patrons, an elderly man who had been watching quietly from his booth. He stood up, his face serious. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice firm. The waitress nodded and hurried to the phone behind the counter. As she dialed, I took a seat, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The other patrons watched me with wary eyes, whispering amongst themselves. I tried to calm my racing heart, but the memory of the creature's eyes, its whispers, wouldn't leave my mind. The police arrived quickly, 2 officers entering the diner with a sense of urgency. They questioned me, their expressions skeptical but concerned. I told them everything, from the basement to the chase through the streets. They listened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. "All right, we'll take a look," one of the officers said, trying to reassure me. "Stay here and rest." As they left, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I knew the creature was still out there, waiting for its chance. And as I sat in the brightly lit diner, surrounded by people, I realized that I was far from safe. The nightmare was far from over, and the real horror had only just begun. The warm light of the diner did little to calm my nerves. Even with the police now involved, I felt a gnawing dread deep within me. The creature's presence was like a shadow in my mind, constant reminder of the nightmare I couldn't escape. The other patrons tried to reassure me, but their words felt hollow. I watched as the officers left, their car's lights flashing red and blue in the foggy night. The waitress brought me a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down in front of me. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, but her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm cup. The steam rose in wisps, mingling with the residual chill that clung to me. I tried to take a sip, but my hands were shaking too much. The old man who had suggested calling the police approached me, his expression kind but serious. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, sitting down across from me. "Want to talk about it?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's more than a ghost," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's something evil. I don't know how to explain it. Like it's from another world." He nodded slowly, as if he had heard such things before. "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy," he quoted softly, his eyes distant. "What you've seen, it's not something that can be easily understood, but you're not alone." Before I could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled again, and the police officers returned. Their faces were grim, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "We checked the area," one of them said, his tone cautious. "We didn't find anything unusual." I shook my head, frustration bubbling up inside me. You don't understand. It's not something you can just find. It's out there, hiding, waiting. The officers exchanged glances. We'll keep an eye out, the second officer said. But for now, you should get some rest. We'll take you home and make sure you're safe. Home. The word felt like a cruel joke. How could I go back to the place where the nightmare began? But I didn't argue. I was too exhausted, too defeated to fight. The waitress handed me my coat, and I followed the officers out into the night. The drive back to my house was a blur. Fog had thickened again, and the rain had picked up, drumming against the car roof like a heartbeat. The police car's lights cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the road. I stared out the window, half expecting to see the creature lurking in the mist. When we arrived, the officers walked me to my door, their presence a small comfort. We'll do a quick sweep of the house, one of them said, just to be sure. I nodded, unlocking the door with trembling hands. The house felt different now, tainted by the horrors of the night. The officers moved through each room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I stood in the living room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, waiting for something to move. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. Everything looks clear, one of them said, but we'll have a patrol car in the area, just in case. Thank you, I whispered, my voice hollow. They left and I was alone again. The house was eerily quiet, kind of silence that presses down on you, making you hyper-aware of every creak, every rustle. I locked the doors, checking each one twice, then moved to the windows, making sure they were secure. My body was exhausted, but my mind was racing, every nerve on edge. I made my way upstairs, the steps creaking beneath my weight. I hesitated outside my bedroom door, the memory of the creature's pursuit fresh in my mind. I pushed the door open slowly, peering inside. The room was empty, just as the officers had said, but it still felt wrong, like the air itself was charged with a sinister energy. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, sliding down to sit on the floor. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me drained and numb. I forced myself to stand and changed into dry clothes, my movements mechanical. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The rain continued to beat against the windows, a relentless reminder of the storm outside. I tried to close my eyes, but every time I did, I saw the creature's glowing eyes, its twisted grin. The hours dragged on, the darkness seeming to stretch endlessly. Sleep was a distant hope, chased away by the lingering terror. And then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from somewhere in the house. I bolted upright, my heart leaping into my throat. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of malevolent voices filling the air. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak, and crept to the door. The hallway was dark. The whispering was unmistakable, growing closer, more insistent. I backed away, my mind screaming in fear. The whispers were all around me now, echoing off the walls, filling my head with their insidious words. "You will never escape," they hissed. "This is your home now." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to shut out the voices, but they only grew louder. I could feel the darkness closing in, cold, malevolent presence of the creature suffocating me. And as the whispers reached a fever pitch, I realized the horrifying truth. I would never be free. The nightmare was my reality. There was no escape. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, enveloping me in a maelstrom of terror. I stumbled back, my body trembling as the voices filled every corner of my mind. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each passing second. I knew I couldn't stay in my bedroom. Creature's presence was stronger here, feeding on my fear. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and raced down the stairs. The house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, every shadow hiding unspeakable horrors. I could still hear the whispers, now mingled with faint mocking laughter. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the living room, my eyes scanning for any sign of the creature. The room was empty, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. I backed into the corner, my mind racing. The front door was just a few feet away, but I knew it wouldn't be that easy. The creature was playing with me, toying with my desperation. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed a plan, a way to escape this nightmare for good. Just as I was about to make a run for the door, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone, using the weak flashlight to cut through the inky blackness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the creature drawing closer. Suddenly, I heard a thud from the basement. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to face the door that led downstairs. The thought of going down there, into the heart of darkness, was almost too much to bear. But I knew that if I wanted any chance of escaping, I had to confront whatever was lurking below. I approached the basement door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into pitch blackness. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the first step, the air growing colder with each step I took. The whisper seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the weak light from my phone barely illuminated the room. I could see old, dusty furniture and boxes piled haphazardly. The basement felt like a different world, a place where the normal rules didn't apply. I moved cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Suddenly, my phone flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled with the phone, trying to get the light back on. That's when I heard it. The soft, deliberate footsteps of the creature. It was here, in the basement with me. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel the creature's presence, cold, malevolent force that seemed to sap the strength from my body. I stumbled over something on the floor and fell, my hands scraping against the rough concrete. Desperation took over, and I crawled away, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature's breath was hot on my neck, its whispers filling my mind. "You cannot escape," kissed. "This is your home now." I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my ankle, and I screamed, kicking out in blind panic. My foot connected with something solid, and the grip loosened. I scrambled to my feet, my hands groping in the darkness for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a rusted old pipe, and I swung it wildly, the metal whistling through the air. I felt it connect with something, heard a guttural snarl of pain. The creature recoiled, and I took the opportunity to run, my legs burning with effort. I raced up the stairs, not daring to look back, and burst into the living room. The front door was just ahead, and I sprinted towards it, my breath coming in frantic gasps. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps pounding on the floor. I reached the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. The door swung open, and I stumbled out into the night. The rain had stopped, and the fog was lifting, first light of dawn breaking through the clouds. I ran down the street, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The creature's whispers faded into the distance, but I knew it was still out there, waiting. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, collapsed onto the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. As the first rays of sunlight touched my skin, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I had escaped, but deep down, I knew the truth. The creature was still out there, and it would never stop hunting me. The nightmare was far from over. The real horror had only just begun. The first light of dawn offered little comfort as I lay on the cold, wet ground at the edge of town. My body was exhausted, but my mind raced with the horror of the night. I knew the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike again. I couldn't keep running forever. I had to end this. Summoning the last reserves of my strength, I stood up and looked back toward the town. The streets were eerily silent, the fog lifting to reveal the familiar, yet now sinister outlines of houses and shops. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning in my lungs. I couldn't let this thing control my life any longer. It was time to face my fear. I walked back through the empty streets, each step heavy with dread. The memories of the creature's whispers and its cold, malevolent presence haunted me, but I forced myself to keep moving. As I approached my house, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the yard. The house looked just as it had the night before, but now it felt like a prison, a place of unspeakable terror. I steeled myself and stepped inside. The silence was deafening, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I made my way through the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, Each room was empty, but I could feel the creature's presence lurking, just out of sight. I reached the basement door and hesitated. This was where it all began, where the nightmare had first emerged. I had to go back down there, confront the source of my fear. With a trembling hand, I opened the door and descended the stairs, the darkness below swallowing me whole. The basement was just as I had left it, the old furniture and boxes casting long, ominous shadows. I gripped the rusted pipe tighter, my only defense against the creature. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to call out into the darkness. "Show yourself," I demanded, my voice echoing off the walls. "I'm not running anymore." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the whispers began, low and insidious, filling the air with their malevolent intent. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the creature's presence growing stronger, palpable force that seemed to wrap around me like a shroud. The creature stepped out of the shadows, its glowing eyes fixated on me. It grinned, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "You cannot escape," it hissed, voice a chorus of sinister whispers. "This is your home now." I tightened my grip on the pipe, my fear giving way to a surge of determination. "No," I said, my voice steady. "This ends now." The creature lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I swung the pipe with all my strength, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The creature snarled in pain, but it didn't stop. It was relentless, driven by a dark, malevolent force. I swung again and again, each blow met with a hiss of fury. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the creature was losing its grip on reality. I could feel its power waning, its presence weakening with each strike. Desperation took over, and I fought with everything I had, channeling all my fear and anger into each blow. Finally, with one last desperate swing, the creature let out a guttural scream and collapsed to the floor. The whispers fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The creature's body began to dissolve, turning into a dark, oily mist that dissipated into the air. I stood there, breathing heavily, the pipe slipping from my grasp. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. I stumbled back up the stairs, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over the house. Terror of the night had passed, but its scars would remain. As I stepped outside, the sun was fully risen, the town waking up to a new day. I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. The creature was gone, but the memory of its whispers, its malevolent eyes, would haunt me forever. I knew I had survived something unimaginable, something that would change me forever. The real horror, I realized, wasn't the creature itself, but the darkness it brought out within me. Fear, the desperation, fight for survival, these were the true terrors that would stay with me. I had faced my worst nightmare and come out the other side, but the battle had left its mark. As I walked away from the house, I knew that I would never be the same. The whispers might be gone, but their echo would linger in my mind, haunting reminder of the night I faced the darkness and survived. The nightmare was over, but the horror of that night would stay with me, a shadow in the back of my mind, forever. If you liked this real and horrifying story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Check out this other real horror story appearing in the video. Thanks for watching.